We're fortunate to have Jane Fine come to speak to us all the way from Brooklyn, New York. Jane received her BA magna cum laude from Harvard University in Visual and Environmental Studies. Can you guys hear back there? No? Okay. Jane received her BA magna cum laude from Harvard University in Visual and Environmental Studies and her MA from Tufts. She's the recipient of grants from the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. She's been a resident at Yaddo, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Malay Colony, the Cité in Paris, among others. Her paintings and drawings have been exhibited nationally and internationally over the past 20 years, including solo shows in Houston, Boston, Milan, Leipzig, San Francisco, and a 5-year survey of her work was on exhibit at Colgate in 2014. Her most recent one-person show just closed in Pierogi Gallery in the Lower East Side of New York. In addition, she also makes collaborative drawings with her husband, the artist James Esper. This work, exhibited under the pseudonym J. Fiber, has been included in numerous group shows in the U.S. So I feel very, very happy to have her here and really looking forward to the talk. Please welcome Jane Fine.
So as Jesse mentioned, my show came down actually Sunday was the last day, and I spent so much time there all month and have been meeting friends and family and gallerists there. So I thought we would just start as if it was still up. So this is an installation shot of the gallery. I'll show you, close-ups of that work as we go. All the work was made in the last 20 months and basically started right after, as we call it down there, the election. And the show is very much affected by the historical moment. I don't know how much people in this room have been traveling to the States, but there is, among pretty much everybody I associate with, a level of stress and anxiety right now that's pretty high and was very much what fit into all the work for the show. Okay, so I just wanted to take one step back and show you what I was doing. Nope, that didn't do it. I think this would do it. No? Okay, the arrow isn't working. How about this arrow? There we go. Okay, so just before the work that led to the show, I was, I guess it was about 2.5 years ago, and I was invited by a friend to participate in a group show on the theme of rainbows. And I was really excited about it, mostly because there were a lot of artists who I really was interested in who were in the show. And over the course of the summer, this is the summer of 2016, I was kind of thinking about the project. Would I make something new for the show? Would I use, I had some work that already existed that was kind of vaguely relevant. Nothing, these didn't exist yet, but they had some sort of arc-like forms with parallel stripes that I thought could be rainbow-ish. Well, as the summer ended, I made this horrible discovery that the curator had somehow omitted me. All the publicity was done for the show, the cards were out, there were advertisements, and she had forgotten me. Well, I was completely angry, then hurt, then sad, and then, like a good artist, decided the only way forward was revenge, and that I was going to make the best rainbow paintings I could possibly make and just make her feel horrible about it, which she has since felt completely horrible. So those and the two I showed before in this are very small paintings. They're like under a foot. Is that, can we do?
Inches of feet?
Yeah, you guys can do that, right? So what is that, 4 centimeters? No.
33 maybe?
Whatever it is. It's small. It's way smaller than that, like a book size. Okay. Anyhow, so I had this idea that this painting in particular I really liked, and I'll talk more about some of the technical things in the paintings later. These are all acrylic paintings, but the rainbows were actually technically very, very difficult to pull off. And I thought it'd be really great to try it on a huge painting. And so I was just getting ready to start on this. I figured out about 2 meters tall. Okay, and I had this painting started. That was the one that was on the poster. So that's you know, size of an average tall man. And the election happened right as I was just starting this painting. So, like most people I knew in the States, I was devastated by the results of the election, but there was a separate part in terms of my studio practice, because my studio was full of these kind of jubilant paintings. You know, not only was I really excited about the election and the first female president, but also my husband and I have a young son. He was just starting high school, so I thought this is, you know, my chance to be 100% fully, you know, back as a full-time artist again. Everything seemed really upbeat, and all that had happened, you know, around the time of the election, I think all I had done was maybe some of the green ground. Well, I just completely lost my way because I didn't understand how I would get back. Like, I was envisioning these rainbow paintings as so optimistic and joyous, and I thought I didn't know how I would get back. I worked on this a little bit, and then I really had to turn it to the wall for about 2 months. And what happened, well, one other thing I want to say about this, although it might be clearer with some of the other work, just a little aside, is that something that's been very important to me as a painter in the last few years is trying to make work that you essentially cannot fully see in JPEGs, that in person has a depth and a complexity that is pretty much not photographable. In this painting, there's matte and sheen, there's translucent and opaque, there's smooth and gritty, there's hard edge and oozing, there's thin and thick, there's kind of wet and dry. Obviously not really, it's all wet, but wetter and drier. I think some of those, this painting is the one that has the most extremes, but I think as we move along, the details of some of the little paintings will make it obvious. Okay, so I turned that painting was just started. I had to turn it around. I went to the Women's March in DC, came back, and right after the inauguration, this was the first painting I really got into. And it was a painting where it was completely improvisational. I mean, I had this idea about the red, white, and blue as, you know, the kind of unifying color palette. But it was a really interesting process working on this painting, because I had this sense, it was so angry and kind of confused, and I mean, looking at it a year and a half later, I feel like the sense of chaos is pretty evident. But I kept, unlike a lot of other paintings I've worked on, I felt a sense of responsibility to other people I knew who felt equally angry, and I kept going back and pushing myself, you know, pushing myself to a level that I think I maybe don't normally attain because of how serious I was taking the subject matter. This is called so much winning, which I don't know if that's a phrase you've all heard up here, but he says that, the orange one. He said we would get tired of him because there would be so much winning. Okay, so I want to say, just for the next couple, I'm just going to read a little bit, because I wrote a few things about abstraction and the way I think of them, and I also am very tired because I've been up since a gesture, so it was really a lot of fun to draw. And in the news all year, 2 years, we've been hearing, like, don't be distracted by this scandal or this scandal, you know, follow the money, follow the money. So I thought it had, you know, kind of a double entendre. Okay, so a little over a year ago, this is a little painting again. It's funny to see it that big. I mean, tiny, size of this. This painting is called After Charlottesville, and August 2017, there were the protests in Charlottesville. Did everybody hear about this? Where we had a bunch of white supremacists marching around with swastikas. Very offensive as a Jew. I'll just add another deeper level of offense to the whole thing. And I suddenly thought, you know what, I'm just going to put the I don't even know if I thought about it. I just started putting swastikas into the painting. I guess I kind of felt like it was so in my head, and I thought, I guess I didn't want to filter it out. Like I just kind of regurgitated itself right onto the board. And this was mostly done the weekend of that action. All right, so this is a teeny tiny little sketch pad drawing, and over the course of the lecture, I'm going to show you a lot of drawings, different kinds of drawings. I used to not show drawings, and I would always get asked about whether or not I drew from my work. So I thought, oh, I'll just answer the question in the talk. We were on vacation. I woke up early one morning, was sitting on the porch with my cup of coffee and my tiny little moleskin sketchbook. Not too long after I worked on that other painting, and I very quickly drew about three little sketches. Each one was by 2 minutes, and this was the sort of the third iteration of the swastika, flower, Jewish star, and it just made me laugh out loud. And as soon as I did it, I thought, I want to do this as a 6 or 7 foot painting, which is what this is. And it's very different. You know, was, if you remember the first image, this was the biggest painting in the show, kind of the main painting. And one thing that was really interesting to me is that the 2 paintings that people seem to respond to the most in the show, in one way were kind of opposites. Was this opposites in one way, in terms of the sort of clarity of thought and planning going into them. This one, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and the other one was that one called So Much Winning, which was just like raw anger. But then as I was, spent so much time at the gallery this month talking about the work, and I was thinking, I watched more and more people kind of respond to those 2 and talk about them, and I realized that in another way they were really the same. They were maybe the 2 biggest paintings that came out of such pure feeling and kind of political, social feeling. One of the oddest things for me about this one, in a way, I think I'd already kind of rationalized painting the swastika, kind of mocking it. I found it really uncomfortable painting the Jewish star, and I think it's because, even though it's always been a part of who I am, growing up in a place like New York City when I did, which was a very, very Jewish environment, it was something that was kind of more private in a way. And it felt really odd to just put it out there, but I think there's been something about this presidency where I think people are a lot of people feel like they want to share, like, I don't know, I guess it's about kind of putting your most private self or putting your vulnerable side out, and maybe, I don't want to turn this into big political talk, but I think you know what I'm talking about. This is kind of the most blunt of all the swastika paintings, the last one I'll show. This is also a very small painting. You can see, I have 3 little ones from the show right now. Again, this is just about 8 by 10 inches. And I like some of these because you can really see the, I like the JPEGs because you can really see that range of texture and thin and thick and silver and matte and so on. And I think it just, to me, this painting was about as straightforward as I could be about hate and money and how they're both kind of circling around our reality right now. Oh, this one has kind of a goofy title too. It's called Unprecedented, which is very hard to say, but I believe he said it at some point, and then it just became a joke. And the news for most of about a year, it seemed like every other day someone was saying, this is unprecedented. I had to use that. Funny little story about this one. Another very small painting in the show. And at the opening, someone came up to me in a crowd of like hundreds of people and said, "Oh, I love the elephant." I had no idea what they were talking about, and I just said thank you because I got interrupted again. And then about 3 or 4 days later, clearly you people see the elephant, but I didn't. And then a few days later, I had about 10 people in the gallery, and someone else said, "I love the elephant," and I said thank you. And then I actually had to get a bunch of everybody that worked in the gallery had to go around, and we had to decide which the elephant was. And the funniest thing was none of us knew. We all decided it probably was this one. But since then, it has, many people showed me where the elephant was. And it's just, I think it's funny, like, you know, I don't know, just a funny example of how different people see art and where those lines of abstraction are. Because, like, I mean, friends had to show me exactly where the trunk was and that the flag was the tail. And then it just seems so nutty, like it even says Trump on what would be the rump. I mean, it's kind of nuts, but I never saw it. Okay, one last one, small one from the show. Another bit of imagery that came into some of these paintings was fencing and barbed wire. And I was listening, some of these were happening while we were hearing the stories about children, family detention and children being detained. And that played into this. One thing, I'll show you, I think I have one, at the very end I have one more installation shot, but the way the whole show was set up is there were about 10 tiny little paintings, so this big, in silver, and then about 7 very large colorful paintings, and it ended up really nice juxtaposition of very colorful and colorless and kind of gestural and more controlled. Okay, so we're going to jump back in history. This is a painting from about 4 or 5 years ago. It's actually my initials, and it has a goofy name. It's called Selfie. And I'll talk a little bit later about how I came to use my initials, but I like to just use this as a backdrop to give you a very quick, like the 1 to 2 minute version of about 25 years of my life. Although Jesse did about half for me, so that was easy. But I grew up in New York City. My mother was a painter, so I grew up around painting. I'll show you 2 of hers in a second. And my father was a accountant. I actually, although I was always loving art and watched my mother paint, I actually wanted to be a mathematician. When I went to Harvard, I actually went to study theoretical mathematics, so I thought. But 2/3 the way through, I switched. Ended up as an art major. Stayed in, altogether I lived in Boston for about 8 years. Finished at Harvard, went to Boston Museum School, which at that time was, it may still be like a great place to really learn about paint in a technical way. It was like a lot of luscious gestural painting happening there. Moved back to New York City in the early 80s, and then in 1986 moved to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which was just at the very beginning of being a really thriving artist community. So for ages I used to do an artist talk, and I would always get asked, why don't you show some of your mother's work? So finally, about 8 or 9 months ago, we photographed a couple. This is the sort of painting I grew up around. They're a little smaller than that. Oil painting, all improvisational, a lot of paint right out of the tube. I was like, you can see some of those big red, and there's like an orange squiggle there where she would just go right to the tube. I used to love watching this stuff. She would paint in our basement, and I could walk to the top of the stairs and kind of peek down when she didn't realize I was there and watch her. It was very emotional too. Like she would often she had a big temper, and she would get really angry at the work and often destroy things, which I didn't understand. But I learned, the more years that go on, the more I understand. I learned from all the watching. Okay, this is as far back as I'll go in the Jane Fine paintings. The red, white, and blue one is from 1989, so it's getting to be pretty old, and the other one is 94. So there were a few years before that where I was, and these are oil paintings. They're about the size of as projected. For the first 2 years out of art school, my work was just going everywhere. I was making tons and tons of paintings, which I think is sort of a good way when you don't know what to do. But some of them were more figurative, some were purely abstract, some were black and white, some were really colorful. It was going everywhere. And I couldn't really grab on, like I loved painting, but I just couldn't find myself. And then this one day, this phrase came to me that what I wanted to do was animate abstraction, and I think it basically is still what I'm doing. And I always think there was some connection between the abstraction and the theoretical mathematician I thought I was going to be. But the animating was kind of the key engine. I wasn't interested in a dry kind of theoretical conceptual painting. The one on the left, was really the first kind of political painting. It's interesting to look at now. I'm going to spare you the long story, but it was right after I won the National Endowment for the Arts grant, and it was kind of in response to that. And the one on the left, with the foot, I think it's kind of funny to see now because it's like such a direct combination of abstraction and animation, like really glued right to each other. This is a couple of years later. I was starting to show my work quite a bit at this point. The yellow one with the big thing. It's actually really, in reality, it was like a real lime green, but it doesn't quite photograph for long. That painting was part of kind of my second important show. And I think what's interesting about that, if you can imagine back then, was when artists were getting their very first laptops, and not laptops, personal computers. And I remember at the opening, all these people saying to me they thought it looked like a desktop computer, and I was like, no, that's ridiculous. But now when I look at it, it looks exactly like those old monitors. I mean, maybe it's like the elephant again. It's like things that you don't see and then you see later. Okay, so right after this point, I started. For some reason, I started to have like a hard time with my work, and it wasn't really a good reason for that. I don't know. I think I had 2 shows in quick succession, and I had just started teaching. Maybe there's just a lot on my plate, and I was having trouble figuring out what the next step in the work was. Also, I was having quite a love-hate relationship with the oil paint. The fumes were getting to me a little bit. There was a lot in just all the process and the cleanup that I was not loving. And then through this teaching job, this is going to be a big visual jump there, I had this chance to be in Paris for 3 months, and it came up very suddenly. It was really exciting, but I knew nobody there. I knew no French. I learned some quick, but it was very drastic. It was like just, it was a chance to be away from everything, family, friends, art practice, my materials. I had only a tiny, tiny place to work. I kind of wanted to reinvent myself, but I was having a lot of trouble. I was making tons of little drawings and throwing everything out. And then I started writing my French lessons just on drawing paper. And then one night, just in kind of a hissy fit, I knew I was being kind of silly. I took this glass of wine I was drinking, and I threw it at this beautiful piece of drawing paper. So the one closer to me is dried wine, and it actually, when the wine dried right away, it was beautiful, kind of purple and striated. later, I made about 8 or 10 with a wine, but they were smelly. They seem to have been, I don't think there's really a problem with the conservation of them, but they lost the bright purple, and it was making the whole living areas, you know, smell like a bar room. So I quickly came up with this idea of like quadruple strength coffee, which is what I used in the other one. And so when I left Paris, I left with about 8 or 10, sort of like this, and essentially what had been the marker line that was the French lessons turned into this drawn line. Right when I came, sorry, oh yeah, that worked. When I came back, I had this idea to try something similar, but with enamel house paint. Again, these are kind of standard size drawing paper, like not quite a meter, and then it's pretty traditional kind of black marker, sort of like a Sharpie on top. And I was making these over a few years, so like I started maybe around 98, 99, 2000. At the same time, I was making oil paintings, and it was a little bit of an odd mix between the two bodies of work. This is a nice one. Is a very small one, so you can really see up close what they look like. I had a show with this in it, and the show kind of begged this question of which group of work was better. I had these oil paintings in them that I somehow still felt kind of emotionally attached to. I thought oil painting had this like deeper psychological resonance, and yet these seemed to be really, people were loving these and responding to these, and I was kind of having this turmoil back and forth. Also, the enamel house paint was not a great idea. It was another thing that just was not very healthy to work with. I was trying to find a way into acrylic paint. And I ended up, in summer of 2001, I found out that this company, Golden Artist Colors, had made all the paint. If anyone saw this movie about Jackson Pollock with, what's his name, Ed Harris, even though Pollock worked in enamel house paint, the movie itself was done using acrylic paint, and I found out that they had helped, you know, consulted on the movie. So I called them, got some advice, and ended up, got some advice from them, did an entire summer of experimentation, and near the end of the summer was making drawings like this with acrylic paint. And then from that, end of 2001, early 2002, this was the first large-scale painting, all in acrylic paint. It was an interesting time, like it was a time of tremendous turmoil in my life. We moved out of the studio we'd been in forever. My father passed away. September 11th happened. And we were thinking about starting a family. There's a lot going on. And it seems like with all, you know, a lot of loss in there, it's an oddly cheerful painting, but I think that for people who've dealt with the death of a parent or some kind of grief, it often can be liberating in a weird way, which is, I don't know, not to say I didn't miss my father, but it was somehow like an impetus to just do something grand. What's interesting about these paintings in one way is that there's a few more coming. That even though, like that last one has some of the emotional quality of the earlier paintings, there's no canvas, there's no brushes, there's no palettes. It's technically a completely different vocabulary. So what was happening at this point, it was, I used to have the news on a lot when I was working in the studio. And this was during the build-up to the Iraq War, and there was a lot of anxiety, lesser anxiety, but in the U.S. about were we going to war, were we not? And it's one example of many in my work where I make a kind of formal decision that ends up having kind of content I didn't quite intend. So the first painting with all the camouflage, closer to me, I was just thinking about colors. Like I remember mixing up these blues and greens and thinking they would look really good together against the brown. It was like just kind of empty, formal idea. And I made these pours of paint working with a a panel flat, and tilting things, and the painting had to dry. And I came in the next day and I thought, that's ridiculous. It looks like camouflage. Of course, I've been listening to, listening to news about the war all day long, all week long. I might as well embrace it and make these paintings actually kind of tackle it head on and make something about, really about what was going on. And then it kind of went on for about 3 years, maybe, these paintings that I thought of in different ways as battlefields. Excuse me one second. And I guess as it went on, I started to think more generally that it wasn't maybe so much about a specific war, but I started to think about all the kinds of conflicts that were involved in my life, male versus female, and at this point we had become parents, and also all the formal conflicts. Like there's kind of like I said about the other painting, there's areas of painting that are done flat and vertically, and there's thin and thick and matte and shiny, and I basically felt like what the battlefield paintings had allowed me to do was kind of bring in this more complicated emotional vocabulary, I guess, into the painting, if that's clear. Okay, so right around this time, Jesse mentioned that I do some collaborative work with my husband, and in 2007, my mother died, and it really shook me up quite a lot. Her death was kind of sudden, and we had become very, very close in about the last 20 years. I was a fairly new parent, and I had a lot of trouble getting back in the studio. And so during that year, that's really when the collaborative work with my husband and I went. He was also very, very close to her, and kind of started in a way, I suppose, as a tribute to her. But for about 8 or 9 months, that was all we did, was work on these collaborative pieces, and we had a really great show of them. I don't have time to show you them, so if you want to look them up, we use a very transparent pseudonym, J Fiber, which is our names kind of blended together. But one of the many great effects of that, besides kind of getting me out of my sad period, was it loosened up my process a lot, and I realized I was missing holding a paintbrush, and the pores that had started out as being really liberating were becoming a little bit stultifying or something. So this is the first big painting I did after the collaborative pieces. It's also about a 6-foot painting. I call it Monument. It sort of is a monument to my mom, but I realized later it's pretty obviously half a Twin Towers. So this is a sweet little painting. I think for many years I've on and off kind of battled with the kind of sweetness in my work, and when I was younger it was something I hated about my paintings. I remember in art school talking my way into this kind of very competitive crit class, and I was the only woman in there, and I looked, I was probably 25 and I looked about 12, and I had this painting of like zoo animals or something, and the professor, who I was kind of the most famous artist I'd ever been around, said something like, I mean, he meant as a compliment, but it was a kind of like, oh, they're so sweet and innocent, and I just was crumbling inside. And I thought, that's not who I want to be. Like, hey, dude, I went to Harvard, I'm like really smart. But decades later, I've come to appreciate that which comes very natural, and I think it needs, something I try to modulate. But this little painting I just think of as kind of pure sweetness, and I ended up, it arrived in a very unplanned way, but I called it First Date because I just thought it was sort of like James and I on our first date. It just felt like a first love, young love. So this is about 2009, and things were going pretty well then. It was I realized as a usually when I put talks together, there's kind of very fertile periods and maybe other periods for me where there's a lot of struggle, and this was a very productive period in the studio. When I was thinking about looking at this, so okay, I was talking earlier about abstraction and all the kind of bits and pieces I stir into soup of abstraction. And I realized they come in categories. There's signs of landscape, like things, you can see a lot of these in this painting. There's trees and flowers and hills and mushrooms. There's flags or signs, like banners, buntings. There's things that have to do with building things up, planks, bricks, scaffolds, and there's a lot of things that refer to repair. Patches. I also like this one because it's the first use of that black patch, and I thought of it, I was kind of reminiscing about junior high school when I used to sew patches on my pants and carefully stitch them all up. This is also a 2009 smallish and larger painting, and I remember thinking about this time that I remember just feeling very free, that I had gone through about these 5 or 6 years where the paintings were very rigid. Like I had this raw wood panel, and then I put these geometric shapes on the panel, and then I made the pores, and then I did something else, and it was almost like a step-by-step thing that I was doing for a while, and I suddenly felt like I was free of that. Like I could, you know, I could drop. I had enough accumulated knowledge and muscle memory as a painter that I could drop those rules. This is another group of drawings. So I could go through these a little quickly. These are very small. These are just a few inches, and it was a time when I didn't have a studio available for a while, and I just had like a drawing table wedged into the corner of the bedroom for a few months. I spent, I've been to many artist residencies. I think you went through a bunch of them, and each time I find that they are hugely influential. I love being away from home, and I think it's because, nothing wrong with home, but I think because I don't work from observation, and I'm very affected by the environment. When I go somewhere else, I just feel like I soak things up as a sponge when I work somewhere else. I had a chance to be in New Orleans for a month, and it really affected me a lot. I think it's because there was something about New Orleans that there's everywhere a sense of celebration. You feel like there's all year long there's Mardi Gras beads hanging from the trees no matter what month you went there. And there's music. There's this kind of whatever surface, I don't know which is more on the surface, the celebration or the destruction. I mean, when we were there was still evidence of Hurricane Katrina, but even beside that, there's this sort of tropical decay everywhere. And I realized I kind of stumbled into the perfect place for me, because I had those themes of joyousness and decay going on forever, and suddenly I was in like the epicenter of those themes. These are all about standard kind of drawing paper size. You'll see a motif that's coming up now. It started with one of those battlefield paintings, but these things that look like masking tape, they're all completely faux masking tape. They're taped off using masking tape, and just became another little bit in the language. So another group of drawings from this time, I started working on very dark paper. I was looking for a way to just really pare down the vocabulary, and I found some pieces of very dark paper that were in the shared flat files. So just asked the dear husband if I could take them, and I tried it out, and I thought it was so, I don't think I ever would have thought to buy it, but I love that look of the dark on the dark, and it suggested to me dusk in a way that it's like dusk and kind of the edge of a different kind of edge of abstraction. That inspired a group of paintings that were actually quite hard to photograph, so I'm just going to show you one of them. And I was so proud of them because they were technically really difficult. For people who have worked in acrylic, acrylic actually dries darker, so to make paintings in a very limited color range is particularly challenging in acrylic. And every single, I have a little detailed one, every single little container, all the colors were pre-mixed and labeled like a, actually I think I have a picture of the studio while I was doing it so you can see, but it was I did a whole show of all very dark on dark paintings. This is a little breather. 4 studios, over about 10 years, I guess. And the top is one of the last oil paintings I ever made. I think it's kind of cool to see what the oil painting studio is like compared to the acrylic studio, because the oil painting studio, you just have everything crammed into a tiny little corner. Once I started working in acrylics for a lot of long, boring reasons, I had to have everything pre-mixed in all these 1,000,001 deli containers. This very strange greenhouse when I was teaching at Middlebury College, one of the oddest studios I have ever been given. And then the other corner was getting ready for the Dark on Dark show, where all these paintings were labeled like brown gray 1, brown gray 2, brown gray 4, you know, BL this, BL that. Okay, I'm gonna start speeding up a little bit. So there's another idea that was cooking in my head for a while, which is that I wanted to find some kind of way to make work about family. And at this point, this is just about 3 or 4 years ago, my son was about 12 or then, and you know, family life was a really important part of my life. And I thought, how could I paint something about it that isn't dreadfully sentimental or dull? And I thought of using initials. My husband also has a J name, James, and it just hit me one day, like the J's are, you know, have one kind of energy, and our son is A for Abraham, and the A is like, you know, it's symmetric, it's solid, it's, you know, for any parents in the room, there are times when you feel like your child is just dominating you, crushing you, taking every bit of energy you have. And I thought, like, the A is like that. It's like a big, strong pyramid. So I started making all these drawings, and they're, again, these are very small. They're just a few inches. All these drawings of the letter A, and then A's and J's. It was really liberating. It made me so happy, and and it was great for him too. Like, he kind of knew they were about him. He just loved it. And then from the J's, I started trying my initials. So this is actually, this goes back. This is was the drawing for that painting, Selfie. And I intentionally signed it really large. This is a kind of dumb joke. And I was trying to make the J, you know, I was just thinking about like making the J as this like aged, decrepit, you know, it's sort of falling over, it's bandaged, it's hairy and old, and seemed like a good idea. So I was at another residency that affected me a lot. Was I was talking about golden artist colors. I went to this residency about 3 years ago, and it was so much fun. I mean, I can answer more questions about it later, but basically, unlike other artist residencies where you just are off in your quiet place, this one was all about technical painting stuff. And you go to workshops where they show you the mediums, you have all your paint is free, you can ask 80 million questions, and it was so great for me. Like a lot of the technical wizardry I've pulled off in the last few years was kind of started there. And it's so fun, you're just down the road from the factories. You can try something, call them up, go, hey Mike, you know, this didn't dry as fast as you said, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so a couple of things from the, 2 paintings from the last show. It's interesting, I was looking back at these the other day and thinking, this one and the next one have these flags in them. And so these are, you know, from the last one-person show was 3 Septembers ago. And I was just trying to remember, what was I thinking, you know, because it was just on the plane today, and I was thinking, like, how did, you know, so there's this kind of political content coming into them, but, you know, it almost took me a bit to remember, like, what it was like to be living in the States 3 years ago. But I remember that something I was thinking about a lot then, which is still in the work, but in a more extreme way, is that, you know, despite all of what's going on in the States right now, and despite the fact that you can't talk to anybody for more than 2 seconds without talking about Trump and Kavanaugh and whatever else, we all lead very privileged lives. You know, I'm very lucky to be healthy and have a wonderful studio and a happy family and whatever, loads of friends and all these things. And I remember thinking at the time that there was still this content that was really important to me. How do you kind of celebrate what you have and yet be really aware of what's outside of you, and all the problems outside. And in some way, I think this, and I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. Okay, wait, forget 1 second that you saw that. So yeah, this, you know, thinking back to that American flag I showed way back, like this is, you know, almost 30 years later, 25 years later, a very different flag. Okay, so I've told some stories and anecdotes, and I have one more to tell, and I know I'm talking a little long, so I'm gonna tell this really quickly. But about 9 months ago, something really. Oh, no, I want to do that. I want to do this. Stop! Why are you doing that? Just when I was getting to the good part. Something very strange happened to me at the beginning of, I made this just for talk. It's about this big. I found out at the very old age of 59 that the man that I thought was my father for my whole life, the man that stayed married to my mother until he died, the man who raised me was not actually my biological father. And it was the most unbelievable realization, as you might imagine. This is what I discovered was my father. This person, that is me as a 20-something. This is a person. After I found out the truth, in 2 weeks of dogged research, becoming the investigative journalist of my own life story, found out the truth. This person was our family pediatrician. He died when I was 5. Now, the reason I'm sharing this is that there's a couple of things, besides that's a pretty amazing story, is that it was kind of incredible how something like one tiny fact, an incredibly old, dusty old, you know, more than 50-year-old thing, kind of turned like my whole life upside down and made me rethink so many things and see myself in a different way, see kind of my past in a different way. And so I found out all this out in the end of January. In the end of March was the last time I gave a talk like this. And I kind of ended with this. I kind of promised a surprise ending, and I ended with this. And it was, there was a talk and then a month residency. And so I said to them, you know, I'm ending with this because I don't know what, like now that I'm here for a month, I want to finally make some work about this. I have no idea what I'm going to do. And somebody asked a really great, there was someone in the audience who'd kind of known my work for a long time, and they asked a really great question, which was, it was sort of a statement question. And he just pointed out how there were issues of, well, there was imagery of camouflage in my work for a long time. There was imagery of things hidden. And he kind of said in a way, like, you're sort of perfectly positioned to deal with this as subject matter. Like, you've been, you know, in some way visually dealing with hidden things and disguised things, and now you have your own secret. Of course, meanwhile, all this is going on with the backdrop of Trump's friggin' scandals every 2 seconds, and like exactly at the heart of the Me Too movement. So my brain was just, oh, and then of course a show that was almost completely made, like all the big paintings were pretty much done. So I had this month to just work on small paintings. So some of the ones I showed you, and I'm just gonna end with these couple. So basically the one other really great question someone asked me at the top, I showed some of the paintings with the black squares in them, the ones that were, they weren't quite done, and so one young woman said, are those actually hiding something? And I said, no, but that's a great idea. And so the very next day I started on this painting, and I actually wrote, like, those are hiding things. Like, I wrote things about my mother and then just put the black squares over them. And then I'll just show you these last two that I made up there. And again, these are all quite small. This one says secrets on the bottom. And I think this you get a pretty good taste of all the sheen and the silver and all this. This last one, I think the word in there is pretty obvious, right? It felt like it was kind of, I was happy with this one too, because I felt like it kind of tied together the subject, you know, what I was thinking of with my story and my new father with the bigger political sex scandals. And this little one was called Make Love Not War. Okay, we can end with this, because this is a last installation shot from the show, so you can see that gives you kind of a good idea of the scale change. And those are the teenies and the big. So that's it, and I'm here for any questions after I drink some water.
Great.